The caretaker's name was David, and he had not spoken to another person in 72 days. His small room was attached to the back of an abandoned warehouse at the edge of a cracked two-lane highway, a building that had once stored agricultural tools before the company failed 5 years ago. The owner was a man named Harris, who owned several properties in the region and paid David in cash every Friday. David did not ask questions about his job. He kept the gates locked, walked the perimeter twice each night, and reported nothing to anyone. The warehouse was empty except for rusted shelves and broken pallets, but one night everything changed. It was a Tuesday, and the sky was the color of old iron. David had finished his first walk of the night when he heard an engine cut off near the loading dock. He stepped behind a concrete pillar and watched 3 men climb out of a black van. They did not turn on any lights. They dragged 4 heavy duffel bags from the back of the van and carried them inside the warehouse. David pressed his back against the cold wall and listened. The men spoke in whispers, but he caught a few words: money, transfer, 3 days. The leader of the group had a scar above his left eyebrow, and he pointed toward David's small living quarters. 2 of the men walked directly to David's door, found him standing in the corner, and dragged him to a storage closet inside the warehouse, a space that had once held cleaning supplies. There were no windows, and the door locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. David heard the bolt slide into place, then footsteps walking away. He was alone in the dark. The closet measured maybe 4 paces by 3. His fingers touched metal shelves and empty plastic bottles. He sat on the floor and waited. Hours passed. He heard the men leave, then nothing. The next morning, the bolt slid open again, and a plate of food with a bottle of water was pushed inside. Then the bolt closed. David ate in silence. He understood that these men planned to use the warehouse as a hiding place, and he had become a prisoner in his own home. On the second night, he heard the men return. They were laughing. More bags were brought in. David pressed his ear to the door and heard the scarred man say the name Harris, something about a deal, something about the owner not being a problem. David had never met Harris in person, but he knew the name from the envelopes of cash left in his mailbox every Friday. The owner was supposed to be a respectable businessman, but now it sounded like Harris was part of the same operation, perhaps even the one giving orders. David sat in the dark and thought. He had no phone. The men had taken his keys and his small flashlight. The only objects left in his pocket were a folded piece of paper and a short pencil stub he used to track his work hours. On the third night, he decided he would not wait to be rescued. No one knew he was here. The nearest town was 30 miles away, and the men had parked their van in front of the only exit gate. But the closet had a ceiling made of old pressed fiberboard tiles, and above those tiles was a crawl space leading to the warehouse roof. David stood on a plastic crate and pushed upward. The first tile cracked but did not fall. He pushed again, harder, and the tile lifted. He reached into the dark space above and felt loose insulation and rough wooden beams. He pulled himself up, careful not to make noise. The crawl space was narrow and filled with dust. He crawled on his stomach for 20 minutes, following a faint line of light from a gap in the external wall. He found a place where the roof panels met the wall, a gap large enough for a man to squeeze through. Outside, the wind was cold. He looked down and saw the highway, empty and dark. He dropped to the ground, landing in a patch of dry weeds, and ran until he reached an abandoned gas station a mile away. His lungs burned, and his hands were bleeding from the broken tiles, but he was free. Then he realized he had nowhere to go. He had no car, no money, and no identification. The men would return and find the hole in the ceiling. They would come looking for him, and they knew his face. David hid in the gas station's restroom for the rest of the night, washing his hands in cold water and looking at himself in the broken mirror. His face was thin and pale, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He knew he could not run forever. The highway stretched in both directions with no signs of life, but he also knew something the criminals did not expect him to know. He had heard the scarred man say that the money would stay in the warehouse for exactly 1 week before being moved again. David had been locked in the closet for 3 nights, which meant 4 more days remained before the transfer. He sat on the dirty floor and made a plan, not a plan built on violence or heroism, but on paper and words. He remembered a small general store 10 miles south of the warehouse, a wooden building he had once passed on a supply run. The owner was an old woman who sold canned food and basic supplies and did not ask questions. David waited until dawn and then walked along the highway shoulder, keeping his head down. It took him 3 hours to reach the store. He had no money, but he found a few coins in his coat pocket, enough to buy a stack of plain brown envelopes and a single ballpoint pen. The woman did not look at him twice. He sat on a bench outside the store and began to write. He wrote the first letter as if it came from one of the criminals, addressing it to the scarred man. In block letters he wrote, "The man you trust with the back door key is planning to take 4 bags for himself. Watch him on Saturday." He signed it with a name he had heard one of them use, Tommy. He folded the letter and put it in an envelope with no return address, just the name of the scarred man. Then he wrote a second letter addressed to the youngest member of the group, a thin man with nervous eyes. That letter said, "The boss told me he is leaving you behind when the money moves. He said you are too slow. I heard it myself. Protect yourself." He signed it with a different name. He wrote a third letter, shorter than the others, which said, "Harris is watching all of you. He will take the money and blame you. Ask him about the warehouse cameras. There are none." He did not sign the third letter. David waited until nightfall and walked back toward the warehouse, staying off the highway and moving through the dry fields parallel to the road. When he reached the perimeter, he saw the black van parked in its usual spot. The men were inside the building, their voices echoing through the open loading dock. David circled to the side where the criminals had left a small access door unlocked. He slipped inside and moved through the darkness, staying low behind rows of broken shelves. He found the duffel bags stacked near the conveyor belt, and next to them a cardboard box containing personal items, a jacket, a flashlight, and a pack of cigarettes. He placed the 3 envelopes inside the box beneath the jacket, then left the same way he came. He returned to the gas station and waited. The next morning, he walked back to the general store and bought more envelopes and another pen. Over the next 2 days he wrote 4 more letters, each one accusing a different person of betrayal. Some letters mentioned specific amounts of money, some mentioned the name Harris. David made sure no 2 letters looked the same, using different handwriting styles, crumpling some edges, splashing a few drops of water on one envelope to make it look old. On the 5th night, he returned to the warehouse again. The men were arguing inside. He could hear raised voices from outside the wall. The scarred man was shouting, and someone else shouted back. David slipped inside and placed the new letters in different locations, one taped to the driver's seat of the van, one tucked into a duffel bag's side pocket, one left on the floor near the men's sleeping blankets, and the last one placed directly on top of a metal toolbox belonging to the nervous young man. Then David left and hid behind a cluster of dead bushes 50 meters from the loading dock. He watched. An hour later, the scarred man walked out of the warehouse holding a letter, yelling. The young man followed, also yelling. They stood in the headlights of the van, face to face, screaming accusations. The other two men came out and tried to separate them, but then one of them found the letter in the duffel bag, and the argument exploded into chaos. Punches were thrown. A knife was pulled. The scarred man screamed that Harris had set them all up, and the young man screamed back that the scarred man was the traitor. Then a single gunshot cracked through the night. David flinched behind the bushes and saw the young man fall to the ground, clutching his leg. The scarred man was holding a small pistol, his hand shaking. The other two men froze, then got back in the van and drove away, leaving the scarred man alone in the parking lot with the wounded young man writhing on the asphalt. The scarred man dragged him into the warehouse. David waited. 2 hours later, police lights appeared on the highway. Someone had heard the gunshot and called from a nearby farmhouse. David watched from the bushes as 2 police cars arrived and officers entered the warehouse. They emerged with the scarred man in handcuffs, and the young man was carried out on a stretcher. The duffel bags of money were seized as evidence. But the owner, Harris, was not there, and one of the criminals, the fourth man, had escaped in the van. David knew that man would tell Harris everything, and Harris would come looking for the person who had written the letters. David did not flee. Instead, he returned to the warehouse one final time, the morning after the police had cleared the scene. The building was empty now, yellow police tape fluttering in the wind. David walked to the small storage closet where he had been held prisoner. The hole in the ceiling was still there, and the plastic crate was still on the floor. He sat down and wrote his last letter, different from the others because it was not meant for the criminals but for the police, to be delivered by an indirect route. David wrote in clean, careful handwriting, describing everything he had witnessed over the past week. He named Harris as the owner of the warehouse and as the man who had hired the group to store the money. He wrote that Harris had visited the warehouse twice in secret, always at night, always without leaving his car. David described the car's color and license plate number, which he had memorized from a previous night when Harris had parked near the back gate. He wrote that the money had come from a series of illegal transactions organized by Harris from his main office in the city. David did not know if all of this was true, but he had heard enough fragments from the criminals' arguments to make a convincing story, and he knew the police would investigate once they had a reason. He put the letter in an envelope addressed to the county police department, then walked to the nearest mailbox at a crossroads 3 miles from the warehouse. He dropped the envelope inside and watched it disappear. He did not sign his name or leave a return address. Then he walked back to the warehouse one last time. The duffel bags were gone, but David had noticed something during his visits. In the back corner of the warehouse, beneath a loose floorboard, the criminals had hidden a small emergency bag containing about $40,000 in cash, separate from the main shipment. They had planned to use it if they needed to run, and the police had not found it. David pulled up the floorboard and took the bag, not as theft but as payment for the days he had spent locked in a dark closet, for the fear that still sat in his chest. He walked to the highway and stuck out his thumb. A truck driver picked him up an hour later, heading north toward the border. David did not say his real name. He said he was a traveler looking for work. The driver did not ask questions, and they drove through the night. 3 days later, the police arrested Harris at his home. The letter David had mailed was enough to open an investigation, and officers found records in Harris's office that connected him to the stolen money and the criminal group. Harris denied everything, but the evidence was strong. The scarred man, already in custody, agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. The young man survived his gunshot wound and also gave a statement. The fourth man was never caught, but none of that mattered to David. He was 400 miles away by then, working at a small farm in a rural town where no one knew his past. He had changed his appearance, grown a beard, and started wearing glasses. The bag of money was hidden beneath the floor of the barn where he slept. He did not spend it quickly, taking out small amounts of $50 at a time, enough to buy food and second-hand clothes. He never contacted anyone from his old life or told a single person what had happened at the warehouse. Sometimes late at night, he would sit on the steps of the barn and look at the stars, thinking about the letters he had written and how ordinary paper and a simple pen had destroyed a criminal operation. He thought about the men who had locked him in that closet and felt a quiet satisfaction. He had not been brave in the way heroes are brave in stories. He had not fought anyone or fired a weapon. He had simply watched, waited, and written words that made bad people turn on each other. That was his talent, his revenge. 1 year later, he read in a discarded newspaper that Harris had been sentenced to 12 years in prison. The scarred man received 8 years, and the young man received 5 years for his cooperation. The article did not mention the caretaker or the letters. It said the case had been solved because of an anonymous tip and internal conflicts among the suspects. David folded the newspaper and placed it in his pocket. He walked to the edge of the farm and looked down the long dirt road. The sky was clear, the wind cool. He had no plans to leave. This was his life now, quiet, invisible, and safe. But every night before he slept, he checked the barn floor to make sure the bag was still there. He did not trust anyone, and he never would. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the fourth man might still be looking for him. That man had not been arrested, and he had seen David's face during that first night in the warehouse. David did not dwell on it. He simply kept his head down, his mouth shut, and his eyes open. The story of the warehouse ended not with a chase or a final confrontation, but with a man who learned that the best way to disappear was to become ordinary. And so he did. The highway carried other travelers. The warehouse was eventually torn down. The gas station remained abandoned. But if you walk along that road on a quiet night, you might still find a single brown envelope caught in the weeds, its ink smeared by rain, its message lost to time. David kept no souvenirs or proof. He simply kept living, one day after another, with nothing but the memory of a locked door and the sound of a bolt sliding shut. That was enough. That was everything.